but it might help with transcript. But just text me if
There we go.
if
It
you'd
started
rather
now.
not.
It just took a little while
Great.
to start.
Okay, thanks so
Okay.
much.
Yep. And I'm going to opt out of this transcription, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, it won't let me stop recording, Caleb, so I'll have to let you do that.
Okay. Yep. I'll be back.
Thanks. Great. Okay. Well, hi, folks. Thanks so much for joining the Marine Spatial Planning Working Group. I did give a brief overview this morning, but for those who weren't able to make it, I will try to just do a brief recap here, and then we'll have our first speaker, Michael Wethington, launch the slew of presentations that we have, and then we'll save the discussion. We can open it up to questions after each of the speakers, and then we'll save a discussion until the end for 1:45. So just to introduce myself, for those of you who don't already know me, my name's Holly Goyert. I'm the director of the Net Positive Initiative at Biodiversity Research Institute, and I'm also co-director of the Applied Ecology for Renewable Energy program. And the overarching theme for what our group has been attacking for the last 8 years has been sort of twofold. First, evaluating avian behaviors around offshore energy development, and we'll hear a few presentations today about that. And then also about planning an avian compensatory mitigation framework related to offshore wind energy development in particular. I already, again, presented on this, but just to briefly go over, we have written in the past a couple of different letters to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, to BOEM, and one of them was 5 years ago here to basically provide a technical review of the BOEM Avian Survey Guidelines. And ultimately, what that ended up leading to was the eTwig from the state of New York, NYSERDA, producing a set of guidelines through the specialist committee. And those are located at this website here. But what's newer and what's happened since then, once the eTwig specialist committee closed out, was that we the RWSC ended up forming the Marine Bird Distribution Working Group. And that was originally led by the Fish and Wildlife Service, but when they had to step down, the eTwig again stepped up and took over to help manage that group. So we'll hear from Julia Golka today on that. The other effort that I mentioned was the letter that we wrote, I think almost 3 years ago now, asking for guidance from both BOEM and the Fish and Wildlife Service on compensatory mitigation for birds impacted offshore wind energy infrastructure. And that led to a workshop at the State of the Science for Offshore Wind meeting in Long Island in 2024. Those efforts were pretty active up until the new administration, and as I understand it, have since been dropped. But again, that has been probably our more recent priority, is trying to help set up a framework for avian compensatory mitigation, specifically related to offshore wind energy. Things have changed a bit, as I think many people have noticed in the last year, which is part of what we want to talk about today. I'm hoping at the end we can have a brainstorming session, but also really just want to hear from you, from the working group, about where you see research gaps, funding gaps, and where we can help direct resources to filling those gaps, because that's been, I think, ultimately our biggest strength in the past. So please stay tuned for that. In the meanwhile, we have a set of great presentations. I'm going to skip over this, sorry. This was about, I'll just show the agenda here. I can actually switch to this. Oh, it's not letting me. I guess I'll, sorry, this is for my presentation this morning, apologies. So our agenda today is we're going to have Michael Wethington speak on the stochastic collision risk avian movement model, for specifically an integrated model that he's been developing with the team on northern gannets. Then we have Evan Adam, who's going to speak to a new project funded by the RWSC on the vulnerability assessment and power analysis, followed by Julia Golka, who would talk about that Marine Bird Distribution Working Group. She'll also talk about a little bit to the tracking group that's also being supported by the eTwig and RWSC. And then we'll move on to our guest Aspen Ellis from the Pacific Coast, who will talk about a prioritization framework for seabirds for research and mitigation. Then at 1:45, we'll wrap things up, talk about the direction that people think the group should move in, and then we have a report out towards the end of the day where I will summarize things. So with that said, Michael, are you available to start sharing your screen?
Yeah, you got it.
Awesome.
Let me do that here.
Yeah.
Okay. How's that look?
That looks great.
Ready? Okay, cool. Let's see.
Nobody in the
Well,
team.
hi everybody. Welcome to the session. I'm Michael Wethington. I'm a quantitative ecologist at the Biodiversity Research Institute. You'll see a number of us today. It's good to see you. It's good to be here. So today I'm going to present on a modeling framework that we're developing that combines ship-based surveys with GPS tracking data in order to assess northern Gannet collision risk in offshore wind developments. With the focus being along the U.S. Atlantic seaboard. So this is very much a work in progress, and we're interested in hearing what people think, and we're actively seeking feedback. So let's see, there we go. Yeah, so today, I think, what do we got? Let's see. Yeah, so I'll just start with a quick overview on collision risk modeling, and some of the two main approaches that are used to estimate exposure, just so we're all kind of on even footing here. And then I'll introduce SCRAM, which is the stochastic collision risk project, which I work on. I'll explain why we think northern Gannets present a novel and interesting modeling challenge. I'll walk through our modeling framework, and then I'll close with some open questions. So measuring wildlife collisions at offshore wind turbines is more often than not extremely difficult, and most collisions go undetected. That's most is an understatement. And so we use models in order to help us better understand what's going on and how to model the collisions. So you might, for those of you who don't know, you might ask, what is a collision risk model? Well, a CRM, it just estimates the number of animals that are expected to collide with rotating wind turbine blades over a given period of time. In this case, we're interested in birds. So a CRM, it estimates just the number of animals that are expected to collide with wind turbines over a period of time, right? They combine information about how many animals are present and available to encounter the turbine. So they're the exposure, the individual is exposed. They also estimate how frequently animals pass through the rotor swept zone, usually referred to as flux. And they also use physical characteristics, so both from the turbine itself and then the birds. So turbine parameters like rotor radius, rotation speed, those provide the geometry and the physics of the hazard, whereas bird parameters like wingspan and body length, those help determine the probability that an exposed bird overlaps in space and time with the moving blade. These feed into the collision probability calculation that inevitably converts flux into an expected number of collisions. So exposure is a really foundational input, and it helps us understand how many birds are where and when. Broadly speaking, there's two main methodologies primary methodologies that are used to estimate exposure. On the left, we have the sort of traditional vessel or aerial-based survey approaches, and those estimate density from often at-sea observations, and they feed into a flux model. So with these, you get broad spatial coverage, but oftentimes surveys treat all birds the same. You very often lack behavioral information. Telemetry approaches, shown here on the right, those start with individual tracking data and use movement models to derive exposure from the actual movement paths. And so here, exposure is mechanistic, but you're really limited by the sample size and the challenge of scaling from tagged individuals to the full population. So as I said, I helped develop SCRAM, and SCRAM stands for the Stochastic Collision Risk Assessment for Movement. SCRAM is many things, but one of the kind of key components is that it's an open source collision risk decision support tool. And right now we primarily are functionally active, focused on the U.S. Atlantic coast. Here you can see, the broader area of interest that we're very often looking at within SCRAM. So SCRAM currently estimates collision risk for 3 ESA listed species. That's piping plover, roseate tern, and red knots. And here, perhaps not surprisingly, we use tracking data instead of just survey density. We're adding common terns, and then perhaps not surprisingly, northern gannets, and to the new models, and we're incorporating additional tracking data sets for the existing species. So, instead of survey density, like I said, SCRAM starts with individual tracking data, whether it be GPS, satellite tag, or, data from the MODIS wildlife tracking system. So we take tagged birds and we see where they go. And then we use that telemetry data to feed into movement models, which help us estimate, daily occupancy per grid cell, or just occupancy, within the study area in grid cells. We sum those across each month. We scale to population level exposure, apply flight height models, and run our stochastic CRM to produce per cell collision risk estimates with uncertainty propagated. So, in the context of collision risk estimation, northern gannets present a really interesting case for integrating both survey data, that survey density data, and then tracking data. Gannets are, in where we live and where SCRAM is often focused. Gannets are largely non-breeding and overwintering birds in, along the eastern seaboard. And so the SCRAM species right now are primarily migrants, so the ones we model. So we model them as single passages through the study area. Gannets are different. So they're residents. They will be here for extended periods of time during the non-breeding season. And while they're hanging around, they sustain a mix of various behaviors, whether it's transiting, foraging, resting, all within the same grid cell. And so a single passage model just can't capture that information. And we feel like right now we have some really good data on both sides from the survey and the tracking data to kind of look into this and maybe do something about it. So just to show you on the left side here shows a predicted relative density for northern gannets during the winter. These models were derived from the Northwest Atlantic Seabird Catalog by Arliss Winship and colleagues. And if we just look at it, you can see a concentration along the continental shelf from sort of southern New England to the mid-Atlantic. On the right side, you have an example of some of the northern gannet tracking data that we have. Here on the right side, you can see a mix of long directional movements, tighter area restricted patterns, etc. And those same birds over here that show up as a single density value on the left are doing very different things on the right. And those differences matter for in the context of collision risk and estimating it. Let's see. Oh yeah. So here, sorry. There's the tracking information. So the framework that we're developing right now, it combines survey data and telemetry data in an effort to just better inform exposure estimates, right? So we're leveraging the spatial coverage from the surveys and that behavioral detail that comes from the tracking data. This kind of just shows the framework at a high level. On the left, that survey data, in our case, we're using vessel-based survey data, shows us how many birds are where. The GPS data pooled on the right, that's providing the behavioral information. So what the birds are doing and where, in each grid cell, what are they doing? These all sort of funnel into this center, which is, where we combine the data and run these behavior-specific collision risk models on the full density surface. So the idea is to weight the collision outputs by behavioral proportions, and then I'm going to walk through each of these individual steps in turn. So starting with the survey side of things, the Northwest Atlantic Seabird Catalog, it compiles decades of aerial and ship-based survey data from along the Atlantic coast. So these observations feed directly into those NCOS models, the relative density models developed by Arliss Winship that I had mentioned. So relative density estimates are great, and they tell us where the gannets themselves might concentrate based on survey data, but they don't necessarily tell us how many individuals there are per square kilometer. And so in order to get this sort of an absolute density estimate that we can use for collision risk modeling, we built a Bayesian distance sampling framework to estimate detection probability from those surveys. So that gives us, how many how many birds, or the detection function gives us an idea of how many birds observers miss, during, with increasing distance from the ship. And then by applying that correction to the relative density, we can update that information to derive a full estimated absolute density. So the figure on the left just shows that's the original relative index. On the right gives us the sort of updated, calibrated birds per square kilometer. So that gives us density, the density estimates. The next we need to incorporate the movement data, to help us inform what the birds are doing. So this figure shows the telemetry side of the framework. We start with raw GPS data, from the tracked birds. And those, for that data, the fixes are regularly spaced in time. So before we can fit a behavioral model, we run a correlated random walk to regularize the fixes, or the steps to 15-minute regular or consistent 15-minute time steps. And so from those regular tracks, or the regularized tracks, then go into hidden Markov models, which classify each fix into a different behavioral state. Right now, we're evaluating two behavioral states, or both two-state models, which look at transit versus foraging, and then also 3-state models, which add a resting state. In the middle, the state diagram just gives you an idea of behavior and the transitions between the different states. And then on the right panel shows 3 of the outputs that feed directly into the collision risk model. So these are the derived parameters. We have the behavioral proportions per grid cell and month, the fraction of bird time spent in each state, behavior-specific flight speed distributions, and then a sort of global flight height distribution derived from the GPS data. So that's the tracking, and this is sort of the core part of the endpoint of pulling this framework together. So on the left, we have those northern Gannet absolute density surfaces that we looked at earlier. On the top panel in red shows us the transit pathway for transiting behavior. And so the transit pathway runs through SCRAM's migration model. Basically, transiting individuals are assumed to make a single directional passage per day at transit flight speed. Below in blue, you have the foraging pathway. And that's an occupancy-based model that runs through, like the band flux model, if you're familiar, and allows multiple passages per day at foraging speed. In both cases, we have GPS-derived flight height. And so each pathway in itself produces a collision estimate, at an endpoint, which is then weighted by the behavioral proportion per state, which is, in this case, the fraction of bird time spent either transiting or foraging in a given cell. And so, after that, we have those estimates. We sum the weighted estimates, and in this case, for a state like resting state, we're just going to assume that those contribute 0 collision risk. So just to give you, a quick overview on like the progress of where things are at. So right now, the density pipeline is more or less complete. We've, have the data extraction, protocol mapping, Bayesian detection function fitting, absolute density calculation, and then identifying spatial overlap with the GPS data. And so all these are done and sort of ready to apply. What's in progress right now, and is actively we're actively developing right now, is the movement side of things. So we're actively fitting the hidden Markov models to identify the behavioral proportions, and then identify the individual speed distributions for behaviors. So while those are right now preliminary, that work is actively going on right now. So very much in progress, but we're making some really solid progress. So it'll be exciting to see where this is at in the next couple of months. So next big steps are just complete the behavioral and GPS flight speed modeling, extract behavioral proportions per survey block. derive flight height distributions from the GPS altitude, and then ultimately run the behavior-specific exposure calculations through SCRAM. So, I just wanted to close with just a few open questions that, where we're actively seeking input. There are more than this, but, for any approximation of brevity, the first is really the data gaps, a data gap issue. So we have areas where we have really good density coverage, but no GPS data, tracking data telling us, what the birds are doing. And so we're wondering, how might we handle those cells? So there's several options on the table right now, ranging from applied regional behavioral averages, borrowing from nearby areas with tracking data, or, taking a more restrictive approach, from there to, moving towards a simpler model elsewhere. The second kind of open question is this idea or question of validation. While we're going to be looking into it, it's critical to know whether, partitioning by behavior actually changes collision risk estimates in a meaningful way compared to just treating all birds the same. And if so, how would we demonstrate that convincingly? So this is particularly important, for justifying the added complexity of the framework. And then third, for other species, the framework here that, I've walked through, this is built around northern gannets. But the architecture is pretty general. So anywhere you have survey density and tracking data with behavioral classification being a possibility, you could theoretically, apply that same approach. So we're really interested to hear whether folks see applications in other species or, other wind energy contexts. With that, I'll just say thank you, and it's looking forward to hearing from everybody else. If you have any questions, feel like chatting, just reach out. Or if you have movement data that you feel like sharing to build this out, we'd also be interested in that as well. So thanks.
That was great. Thanks, Michael. I know some of you may have attended Pacific Seabird Group last week and gotten a sneak peek of this, but I wasn't able to make it. So it was fun for me to actually get to see this all come together. Does anybody have any questions or want to respond to Michael's questions? And maybe, Michael, if you don't mind, unless somebody asks you something right now, at some point, could you put those questions in the chat just so people can
yeah, I'd be happy to.
Just process them and see if anybody comes
process.
up with suggestions.
Great, sounds good.
We have Peter Payton. How is avoidance behavior incorporated into these models?
That's a great question. That specifically might be, at least for the approach to avoidance, that might be, I might field that question or push that to Julia, who's actually working on the movement mechanics of these. If she's here,
is it worth just saying that avoidance rates are included in the collision risk modeling side, but not so much on the movement modeling side?
Yeah, that's totally fair. Absolutely fair. Whether it's, what's going to happen from the behavioral component, if we're using that, if we're deriving that in part from the tracking data itself, that is more of an open question that I think depends on where the modeling pipeline goes.
I don't think we have enough information about kind of avoidance by behavior type. If we did, it would be great to incorporate that. I don't think we're quite there yet.
Yeah.
Great.
I mean,
Thanks, Julia.
We're incorporating macro avoidance into the model based on studies mostly from Europe that have looked at this, though we're actually looking at it with some of the Project WOW data that are contributing to Michael's study now. So we might have some updated ideas on like macro avoidance. Micro avoidance is going to be trickier right now. SCRAM and other collision risk models like it use pretty generalized estimates of avoidance that we're getting more and more information on every day. So it's usually incorporated through like a binary, like so given that the animal is in the rotor swept zone and would have collided with the turbines, like what's the probability that it didn't? And so it's a hard thing to estimate, but there's more information coming on that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kevin. I'm glad you made it, Julia. For those of you who were on the calendar invite originally, we reshuffled things because Julia had a meeting right before this. So I'm glad that she was able to make it now. I think what I'll do is I'll leave it there and we'll move on to Evan for our next talk. Thanks so much, Michael. And if you're able to stay on, right?
Yep, you got it.
Just if people do have questions, they can send them in the chat and we can always readdress back at 1:45.
Of course, yeah. And always feel free to reach out.
Thanks so much.
All right.
All right. So, Evan, are you ready to share your screen? And I know we're about 5 minutes behind. I'm not too worried about it. I know I contributed to that in the beginning, so we have plenty of time at the end. So just don't feel like you have to rush. But I know we do have a few more speakers after this. So go ahead. Thanks, Evan.
Thank you, Holly. I will try to go fast because I don't have a ton of fun new things to say because this is a project that has just started, but we thought it would be Holly reached out and we thought it would be interesting to make sure everyone's aware of it. So a new project that's interested in updating some previous information and gathering some new information about how we can best design studies and prioritize research in the offshore environment. This is a very collaborative project. There's 5 sort of participating collaborators involved, and it's a project funded through the RWSC. So it's part of some region-wide efforts there. I'm just going to talk a bit about, like, broadly speaking, what we're doing with this project, what kind of outcomes we're hoping to get. If you're interested, feel free to reach out to me afterwards. I'm happy to talk more about this. But just generally speaking, the folks we have involved we have several collaborators from the Biodiversity Research Institute, including myself, Holly, and Kate Williams. We have a collaborator, Beth Ross, over at Ross Eco-Analytics. We have some collaborators over in St. Andrews, the University of St. Andrews in the CREAM group, Lindsay Scott Hayward and Sonia Soyuno. We have Juliet Lamb over the Nature Conservancy, and we have Julia Robinson, Wilmot Graveforcy, Erin Amici, and Michelle Vukovic over at Normando Associates. And so what are we all doing? Why are we getting all these people together? Well, we have 2 major objectives for this project, and they're distinct but linked. And so there's there's 2 kind of major kind of activity centers here. The first is an updating to the vulnerability assessment that Julia led 13 years ago now, which is just to make me feel extra old, which was our first sort of assessment of vulnerability for mostly seabirds due to offshore wind in the Atlantic coast. And so that information has been used repeatedly over the past 13 years to support a variety of different activities, including like permitting, planning, research prioritization, and a number of other things. And it's time for an update. There's been sort of significant changes in how we think about offshore vulnerability, the amount of data we have on this, and just changes to like the frameworks that in the ways that we think about these sorts of problems. And so fortunately, we've been given an opportunity to do that. And fortunately, we have Julia to lead another version of this. And so we're going to be taking information from some of the more recent vulnerability assessments on the Pacific coast and the Gulf of Mexico, which we actually just completed. And there's a paper in review on now. And so we're going to be taking some of those ideas and transferring them over into vulnerability land. That means we're going to be adding a lot more species, including migratory shorebirds and landbirds, and really building out our understanding of vulnerability in those locations. Further, we're going to be taking that information and we're going to be synthesizing it so that we can better understand what is related to vulnerability in these offshore environments across multiple species, so we can get better generalizing our understanding of vulnerability to species where we have less information or locations we have less information. And then on the other side of things, we'll be looking into how we can better design studies so that we can understand some of these potential impacts of offshore wind. We were just talking about avoidance behavior with Michael's last talk and macro avoidance. One of the more common effects seen in Europe due to offshore wind developments is changes in macro avoidance behavior in seabirds, including both attraction and displacement. And so if we want to understand how that's happening, if that's happening in North America, that means we're going to have to do research to help support that. So that means we need to have a good assessment of what kind of effects we might be predicting, as well as an understanding of what sort of studies and what sort of study designs are going to be most effective at detecting those changes in behavior. And so altogether, we can kind of link these things by we want to make sure that we're assessing high vulnerability species for changes in behavior and using that to using that to design really effective studies moving forward. So we have a variety of tasks. We have 6 of them. There's a bunch of folks that are involved with each. I'm not going to get into the gory details on this. Happy to talk more about this later. I'll just go through them one by one so you can get a sense of what's going on. First, we're going to be coordinating activities across collaborators and across like the broader research community. We're going to mostly be doing this through the RWSC, and this is going to be going on through like the entire project. And so activities like this and others, we're going to be reaching out to the research community and the management community in the area who are to make sure that people are aware of what we're doing and get feedback on some of the things that's going on. We'll be doing a vulnerability assessment. That update to Julia's 2013 assessment is coming soon. We have been talking about this at the RWSC Bird and Bat Subcommittee group, as well as some of the other working groups below that. So there's been already activity about that. We have a species list out for review now. If anyone else wants to have a look, let me know. We have that up on, I think that's up on the RWSC SharePoint, so that can get shared around. We're going to be looking at different kinds of vulnerability, including collision vulnerability, displacement vulnerability, or behavioral vulnerability, and as well as population vulnerability. So there's going to be a lot of different components to vulnerability. It can be a bit mix or match depending on which sort of vulnerabilities you want to be looking at for your species. Yep, there's going to be like different ways that we assess each of these things. There's different components that go into each of these vulnerability assessments. This is what Julia et al. Did for the Gulf of Mexico assessment that they just recently submitted. And I think we are planning on doing something similar, but we are also getting feedback on this process as well when we get a little bit further into it. So to get a handle on how animals are actually changing their behavior, vulnerability assessments are good overall at telling us what's going on, but we actually need to get a little bit quantitative about how we do this. So we need to essentially build redistribution functions for these animals to say like how they are going to be changing their distributions from pre-construction to post-construction. And we have to get pretty specific about what proportion animals are leaving and what areas they're leaving from. And so we've been actually working on this with the BRI team, with the folks over at CREAM. This is actually kind of an offshoot of some of the things we've been doing with Project WOW also, where we're going to be using some data sets there to help understand what kind of behavioral changes we should be expecting. And we can use this to then lead into task 4, which is how do we get an assessment of what kinds of studies we need to successfully detect displacement in offshore environments. So here, this is a combination of CREAM, the BRI team, and Ross Ecoanalytics, who are going to be trying to pull together a lot of different types of uncertainties we have offshore in terms of animal distributions, their changes based on offshore wind, and other sorts of changes in the offshore environments, and pull that into one kind of cohesive assessment of how good we are at detecting behavioral changes due to offshore wind, and pulling it all together into a spatially explicit power analysis that Lindsay developed a few years back, and we modified for Project WOW a few years after that. And now we're trying to kind of do another round of modifications to make sure it's as helpful as it can be in a variety of different environments where you have either a lot of information beforehand or maybe a little bit less in some cases. So lots of cool stuff there. We actually have a variety of different things we're exploring in terms of what sort of studies and parameters we're interested in, ranging from percent coverage of strip transects to survey buffer around a developed area, what kinds of surveys you might be doing, and then all the way down to bird behavior information about how much displacement we're seeing and what kind of environmental changes are present in these locations. So we're really building out a variety of scenarios that we want to test here. And just so you know, we presented this at State of the Science a few years ago, but we have some preliminary assessments of how effective we are at detecting displacement in certain animals based on their displacement traits. And so we are kind of lumping alcids, gannets, and loons together into some broader taxonomic categories and finding that, essentially higher survey coverage is necessary for detecting displacement in some of the species that either displace quite significantly in terms of like a large displacement buffer, or just displace a lot. Larger surveys end up being quite a bit more effective. So we want to keep building on this and get a better understanding of what's going on and how we can build the most effective research and monitoring programs that we can to understand these things. This is the task 5 is the vulnerability synthesis task. This is the one that Juliet over at TNC is leading. We're going to be deconstructing the vulnerability assessment that we pulled together and really try to understand what sort of species traits might be related to vulnerability and different kinds of vulnerability in these species. We really want to build a robust system and try to understand how we might be able to take these ideas and take this information and expand it to locations where we have less species-specific information that we would normally need to build a vulnerability assessment. And so this is going to be more of a meta look at what we got going on there. And then finally, we want to bring it all together and turn it into guidance on for that we can use to update what we've already have out there. So the Avian Displacement Guidance Committee, which is an ETOI committee from a few years ago, created some survey guidance that has been helpful, but it really just identified how much, we had some good general guidelines, but we didn't really do a lot of quantitative work to support that. This is the quantitative work that's going to support that now. So we can be even more clear about what sort of key survey design parameters are necessary to make sure that that surveys are going to be effective. And also we're going to provide general guidance on how anybody can do some survey design analysis so that they can support a study such as that. Finally, I just wanted to mention here that this project is is conducting co-production through the RWSC and their supporting working groups. This project is going to be engaging the community in a variety of hierarchical ways. We're going to be interacting with the Bird and Bat Subcommittee and sort of a quarterly update framework. We have interactions with the working groups below that, like the RWSC Marine Bird Distribution Working Group and the Tracking Working Group as well. Those are going to be getting like bi-monthly feedback from our project, and as well as we have a project steering committee that's going to get detailed involvement and help us make sure that we're using the best methods we can and get detailed feedback on some of the techniques that we're using. So we're going to be kind of engaging everybody all along the way for this 2+ year project and making sure we get feedback from everybody and we can make something that is not only scientifically robust, but actually useful and applicable in this world, because that's ultimately we want to make sure that this is useful to everybody. So went a little bit over, apologies. But I will stop there. It was probably a long talk for a whole lot of we haven't done anything yet, but we are starting to do things. So the things we're gonna start seeing things trickling out into the Bird and Bat subcommittees and other such groups fairly soon here. So yeah.
Well, I love that you brought it home to the guidelines, because I think ultimately I know we keep coming back to that, but I don't want to forget that was one of the initial big tasks of this working group, was to sort of help drive that process from the very beginning. Can you not hear me?
I got you. Can you say something again? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
That was on me.
Anyway,
not you. It was me.
Everybody else could hear you.
Okay, good. And Kate's been, played such an important leadership role in getting all those working groups going. So we're very lucky to have those. Any questions for Evan before we move on to Julia? And Julia, maybe I'll ask you to just get your presentation ready and we can give people some time to think and maybe even just ask more questions at the end.
Everyone's got, I'm sure, loads of questions over the no information that I provided everybody. So.
It's definitely relevant to this group. So thanks, Evan. All right. Yeah. Why don't we just go ahead with Julia, and then any questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat and we can address them after her talk for Evan.
Awesome.
Thank you.
You can see my slides and hear me?
Yeah, sounds
okay,
good.
Perfect. Yeah, so just providing a brief overview of the Marine Bird Distribution Working Group, which has been mentioned a couple of times, and what that group is working on. But first, just a little bit of high-level information about the RWSC more broadly for folks that maybe aren't as familiar with it. So this effort was launched in 2021 and is made up of kind of 4 sectors to work together to conduct, to support research on marine life in U.S. Atlantic waters. And the idea here is really to serve as a hub to increase collaboration, make sure we're reducing redundancy, supporting data standard efforts, and increasing data sharing. And so it's led by these 4 sector caucuses: federal, state, industry, and ENGO, with equal representation on a steering committee. And the RWSC is hosted by the Northeast Regional Ocean Council and Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean, with support from the Coastal State Stewardship Foundation. And so within the structure of the RWSC is also these subcommittees, which are really the core groups of experts that share information about ongoing and planned research, help identify data gaps, and maintain alignment and coordination among research and data collection teams. And so there are 7 subcommittees, one of which that Evan just mentioned is the Bird and Bat Subcommittee. And then within that Bird and Bat Subcommittee, there are 3 working groups. And so we have the Marine Bird Distribution Working Group, the Bird and Bat Tracking Working Group, and the Offshore Bat Working Group. And so the first 2 of these are currently supported as well by NYSERDA, and through that, BRI is providing technical support for the working groups as of mid-2025. And I'll mostly focus on the Marine Bird Distribution Working Group and what we've been working on, but I'll touch upon kind of the overall goals of the Bird and Bat Tracking Working Group as well. So the overall goal of this working group is really around collaborative coordination of research to really understand marine bird distributions in relation to offshore wind development. And so we have kind of 4 main goals, one of which is really encouraging the use of surveys as a key method. But also we want to be exploring ways in which we can integrate multiple data types to assess changes in marine bird distribution. So surveys aren't the only method. We should be thinking about how we can incorporate different data sources to continue to improve our understanding, continuing to improve guidance on a range of standardized monitoring methods, which goes back to what Evan was just talking about, and coordinating and improving regional scale implementation and analysis to try to understand these broad scale changes in marine bird distributions. There's only so much we can do at the project level, so trying to understand what's going on regionally. So in kind of mid-2025, we laid out these 8 working group of objectives, and the kind of time span we're working on is kind of a 2-year kind of plan for what we're trying to achieve. And so these are kind of various detailed versions of those objectives, and I'll focus on the 3 that we've been working on over the last kind of 8 months or so. First is on guidance, on the importance of monitoring changes in marine bird distributions. And we're going about this in a couple of different ways. The first is working on a manuscript that Juliet Lamb at TNC is leading, really trying to lay out what we know about not just, changes in behavior, avoidance, displacement, attraction in relation to offshore wind development, but what are the actual mechanisms and potential consequences of those changes. So if birds are changing their behavior, does it matter? And how can we think about frameworks to understand what those consequences might be, as well as what are the challenges to trying to assess those consequences? We're coordinating with the RWSC research project that Evan just presented on. And so as part of that, as Evan kind of hinted, we're going to be trying to update the existing avian displacement guidance based on the results of that study, particularly thinking about refining guidance around survey design, and also really trying to balance information with resource constraints, species prioritization, and really how we can best conduct regional scale survey efforts. Second thing we've been working on is just a working group webpage. You can access it with the QR code here, which gives you more information about what we're working on as a group. We've got a work plan there, but we also wanted to start trying to collate existing resources. So all of the different guidance documents, kind of key scientific literature on changes in marine distributions in relation to offshore wind development, various species prioritization efforts, and what's out there in terms of marine bird distribution data. And then the third thing that we've been working on is data standardization. And this is a broader RWSC effort that the working group is helping to support. So Duke, with support from the RWSC, Duke is working to integrate the Northwest Atlantic Seabird Catalog into OBIS CMAP. The goal really here is to make it more publicly accessible, providing DOIs for data sets, and really increasing standardization moving forward. And so the working group is helping coordinate with them, provide feedback on the process, and really supporting the development of things like criteria for inclusion of data in the kind of catalog component of OBIS, helping develop things like data templates, field definitions, metadata documentation. And Sarah and Emily are actually presenting more broadly about this effort tomorrow. So if you're interested in learning more, definitely tune into that talk as well. So this is kind of just going back to these overall objectives and what we're trying to do alongside what we've been working on over the last couple of months. We're also thinking about things like how do we cooperatively fund regional scale surveys? What might that look like? How could we operationalize that? Again, trying to think about integration of different data types, not just surveys, to improve our understanding, and just continuing to educate the working group and the community about various projects that are going on. So BRI is also supporting the Bird About Tracking working group. And a couple of the things that group is currently working on includes updating the existing MODIS guidance for deploying MODIS stations on offshore turbines and buoys. That's in process now. It's been out for stakeholder feedback, and so they're working on updating that. Also developing some interim guidance for tracking birds and bats in relation to offshore wind development, particularly focused on MODIS tagging, since that's been a primary focus in terms of what developers are planning to do at the first developments. And so they're working on that as well, with plans for release in the coming months. And then longer term priorities, thinking about developing some more comprehensive guidance around offshore tracking data collection and management, supporting coordination across regional tracking efforts, and also thinking about some of this kind of collaborative funding and what that might look like. So that's kind of what we've been working on as working groups. Anyone is welcome to participate in both the subcommittee and the working groups. There are links here if you're interested in getting more information, or reach out to me if you want to get on the list for any of these groups.
That's great. Thanks so much, Julia. And I'll just point out one thing that Caleb had mentioned earlier in the morning when I gave the introduction to this working group is that we started out sort of a combination between a survey and a tracking working group. So while we've generally prioritized surveys as methods, tracking has been an important piece to what keeps coming up over and over again with all of our conversations. So I think all of these, thanks for presenting on both of these groups. And I think they're all definitely, they're relevant to our past conversations. And obviously we're really excited that you're taking this moving forward with your leadership and keeping us all organized and advancing. So, does anybody have questions for Julia or Evan? And if you have questions for Michael as well, you can also put those in here. He did copy the open questions that he had posed in the chat. You're welcome to have a look at those, even if you didn't see his presentation. If you missed it, I'm happy to clarify any questions on that. And if not, we can also, I just want to make sure, is Aspen available and ready? Okay, great, awesome. And your presentation is ready?
Should be good to go.
Let me give folks just like another minute. I don't want to, yeah, maybe not a whole minute, but just a few seconds to digest, because I know that was a lot of information. And basically what we're doing now is we're kind of switching topics from the whole sort of collision displacement guidance to now back to our sort of more recent prioritization, which was towards mitigation for birds. And so Aspen's going to be presenting to us on some of her efforts in the Pacific and I think it'd be, it's always good to hear context on how things have maybe morphed over the last year. Because I think it's a constant moving target these days. But that said, I think I'll just go ahead and pass it along to you, Aspen, and then we can open it up to more discussion after the fact.
All right, that sounds great. I unfortunately am having one Teams issue. I may have to quit and reopen. Give me one moment.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. While Aspen's doing that, I did present this morning on how we've had a few co-authors that helped to draft the letter to the service and BOEM on requesting guidance on avian compensatory mitigation for offshore wind energy development, and that effort has just been on hold for the last year. That's mostly my fault. It has to do with just different priorities. Also, my position has shifted, and policy changes in the last year. So the messaging in the paper has shifted. So if you have any interest, even if you weren't involved before and you're interested in working on that now, I'd like to be able to revamp that in April, hopefully. I'll be trying to get the co-authors back together to get that going again, figure out our next approach. It might end up being a shorter paper, but at least it'd be good to get something out. Looks like maybe, did we lose Aspen for a sec? Yeah, so hopefully she can figure things out and then come back on. With respect to the compensatory mitigation discussion, here we go. It does remain one of our priorities. The question is timing. So again, shifting priorities. Feel free to participate now if you weren't before. Just reach out to me, and otherwise, if you were an active participant in the past, you'll be hearing from me soon. Aspen, how are you doing? Great.
Good. Are you able to see it now?
Yes, and see and hear you. Thanks so much.
So sorry for the delay there. Teams always gives me an
problem.
issue. But glad to be here today. Thank you all. Really great to hear the updates from the East Coast as well. Looking forward to seeing the work that keeps coming out and how it continues to inform what we're doing here on the Pacific. But happy to talk about some of that today. So I'm Aspen Ellis. I'm a PhD candidate at University of California, Santa Cruz, where I've been working for about 5 years now, working on primarily the compensatory mitigation side of offshore wind energy development out here, and trying to develop tools to be able to better strategize that and inform regional policy moving forward about how we can try and plan compensatory mitigation at more of a regional scale. And this is some work that came out of that effort, but we're currently using it not just to inform potential mitigation, but also to help inform where research priorities need to be as we're starting to develop these plans in our region. So thinking about this broadly, a lot of why we're talking about this now is just thinking about how rapidly projected a lot of offshore wind energy development is globally, and how a lot of the approaches that have been developed in the past to handle policy research and management at local project-by-project scales are likely to need to adapt as we now have to think about the regional cumulative scale of impact and trying to manage that proactively to be more strategic about how our resources are being spent. And so this planning tool that I'm going to be talking about today came out of that need, trying to get ahead of that as we're trying to think about development here in the Pacific, instead of replicating that project-by-project approach, trying to build in a structure to manage these priorities at a regional scale from the get-go. And so as we're thinking about vulnerability here, we're talking about these three primary components of vulnerability, the first being exposure or spatial overlap, which we use Jeff Learnus's at sea densities as species distribution models to quantify. Behavior and morphology leading to sensitivity to either collision or displacement impacts, which here we have the updated vulnerability index that Emma Kelsey and others at the USGS here developed and then updated just last year. And then IUCN Red List status and other metrics for population status and baseline demography that may make additional impacts of offshore wind more or less important at the population level. And so what we're talking about doing is using those multiple different metrics of vulnerability to be able to, at the regional scale for California, but then ideally applying the same approach to other regions moving forward, be able to make more sense of the vast number of species that may be impacted by offshore wind, and instead be able to sort of assign these priority threat categories to those species based on the information that we do already have about where they're likely to be, what their sensitivity is likely to be, and what their baseline population threat statuses are. So the objectives of this work are both to develop that framework to identify priority species, both for offsetting and then research projects, and then apply that framework to the California current ecosystem. And I'll talk mostly today about how we've applied this approach to the California proposed lease sale areas, since the Oregon wind energy areas are currently indefinitely stalled in our region. But one key piece of this project is that it's supposed to be iterative and be updated as additional development becomes available. So what we've done is we've also rerun this at the larger spatial scale as if the wind energy areas in Oregon will move forward to show how those priority species will shift as cumulative impact continues to shift in response to increasing development. So the conceptual framework here, I'm sure many of you have seen at meetings before, but the idea is that in order to be impacted, a species has to first be present in those development areas. If they're not there to begin with, it doesn't really matter if they're sensitive or threatened. In terms of offshore wind energy impact, that would be a low priority. But if they do have notable presence in those development areas, we then want to think about both collision sensitivity and displacement sensitivity separately, but understand that it would have to be low sensitivity to both of those that would be a moderate priority species, whereas any kind of collision or displacement sensitivity would matter for that species, and you would then want to think about what that exposure and sensitivity would mean for the species population based on its existing baseline status, and that being the difference between sort of a high priority and an extreme priority species. And this is the conceptual framework that we came into this work with. But what we've recognized throughout this work is that strict cutoffs between high and low criteria for each of these are often arbitrary, and results are highly sensitive to those metrics. And so we've instead opted to use an exponentially weighted multiplicative formula to combine these metrics, following a conceptual framework here, with exposure weighted the most heavily, followed by sensitivity and then status, to be able to replicate this sort of decision tree approach. So that's the basic idea here. We rescale all of our exposure, sensitivity, and threat metrics to the same numeric range, and then weight them separately according to the ideas on the conceptual framework. Again, using Jeff Learness's species distribution models and others in the California current region for displacement. Exposure. The updated Kelsey et al. Vulnerability index for sensitivity to displacement and collision. And then we use primarily the IUCN red list statuses as a metric of their baseline population status, but then also overlay that with local population statuses as well. And so just showing how that works here, we first start by compiling a regional species list based on extensive literature review, so trying to rule out any species in the region that would be considered a vagrant, as inclusion of very rare species may sort of disproportionately rank them highly. So any species that has regular use of the region is what we're concerned about here. And then from there, what we're doing is we're looking at the proportion of their regional use that is within those wind energy areas based on those species distribution models. So the percent of the regional density that overlaps effectively with those grid cells within the development polygons. Then they're rescaled and standardized displacement and collision sensitivity scores considered separately and then combined as well. And their IUCN threat status. Rescale each of those to a common metric, assigning values to the IUCN population statuses based on the understanding there's a tenfold difference in extinction probability between each of those categories. So applying an even stepwise approach between those categories to replicate that. And having everything rescaled at a geometric midpoint of 1. And the idea with that is such that when you start with that exposure score, you can think about species having a range of different exposure to impact within the region. Then multiplying that exposure score by the sensitivity score such that a low exposure metric would reduce the priority of a very high exposure species, and vice versa. If you had a moderate exposure species, but a very high sensitivity, it would increase that priority status. And then thinking about how that number changes once again when you multiply it by threat status. So the species that would have the highest ranking here would be species that overall had high exposure, high sensitivity, and high threat. Some results here. I'll note that this work is currently wrapping up. We're trying to get this out to a journal pretty soon. And so if people are interested in more complete versions of this, I'm happy to share preliminary results as we're finalizing that as well. But like I said, this is going to be shown here on screen for the California lease areas. And what you'll initially see here is this is split by taxonomic family with the colors in the background. And what we've been able to broadly demonstrate is that, at least in the California current region, there are no broad taxonomic trends to speak of. Vulnerability varies at the species level based on those differences in exposure, sensitivity, and threat status. But there are some high priority species that filter out that I do want to highlight. Species including pink-footed shearwater and Cassin's auklet rank out very, very highly in our framework based on very high exposure to these facilities, and then also based on reasonably high displacement sensitivity and existing IUCN baseline population threat status. Red-necked phalarope and red phalarope as well filter out pretty high. These are species with very high associated uncertainty in collision impact based on very low information on flight heights for phalaropes. Based on that, they end up pretty high in the ranking. And then other species like ashy storm petrel and Guadalupe merlet, which are also really important California species based on highly concentrated breeding populations in the region, also filter out pretty high as well, primarily based on displacement sensitivity and their high exposure metrics based on their spatial use within the region. And what I want to especially note is that none of those very high priority species are currently ESA listed. And so currently local policy is not going to focus on protecting or driving research for those species. So a key finding of this work that I want to really highlight here is that thinking about this at a broad taxonomic scale is going to bring priority species to light that we currently don't have existing status for. And so thinking about how California as a state and then also existing plans to develop more regional decision-making groups for the California current region may need to supplement that existing policy to be able to effectively study and protect these high priority species. There are a few species that do consistently rank out pretty low. This is going to be primarily based on really low exposure, since again, that's the most heavily weighted metric within this formula. And so those species tend to be either very highly pelagic species that don't really come into the development areas or very highly coastal species that don't really leave the highly coastal region as well. And so cormorants typically filter out very low. Murphy's petrel, laysan albatross, other procelariids that use mostly very far offshore regions are not going to be super high priority here. Oh, I'm sorry, before I flip, the one other thing I want to note here is that we do have some very high uncertainty species. These are mostly threatened species that were very data limited and so didn't have solid exposure scores that could be produced by the species distribution models. And so we generated those exposure estimates using a structured expert elicitation process based on which provided those particularly high uncertainty metrics for those species. It's worth noting that those are primarily the ones you're seeing on the screen here are short-tailed albatross, Townsend storm petrel, and Hawaiian petrel, all of which may be high importance for local conservation, especially short-tailed albatross, given that that is ESA listed. And so I see that as a data priority moving forward to be able to improve baseline monitoring for some of those species for distribution particularly. Like I said here, these are based on the California leases, the 5 leases that are split between these regions off of the coast of Humboldt and Morro Bay. It's 57 species that we have data for, along with some data deficient species that we highlight as priorities for additional research based on other metrics of their sensitivity and threat status. But what we do as well, while we report this primarily, since it's the main goal for California decision-making right now to understand how they're responding to these existing leases, we also rerun the framework to revise as these future development areas are identified. So as a metric of this, we use the potentially planned in the future identified areas off of Coos Bay and Brookings as a metric of how these priority species may shift as future offshore wind energy is developed, and present those results as well in the report that we'll be publishing. And so what you can see here, while there's a lot of similarity between those species, since those California regions are still included, and since a lot of species use is similar based on this distance from the shore and over the shelf break, there are some species that then end up filtering out more highly as well when you do include these Oregon regions. And so you can see this here. There's a lot of similarity, but there are some species that end up filtering out as we do additional development down the line. I'll close here with a brief note about uncertainty. We were able to propagate exposure uncertainty through this tool based on the associated coefficient of variation values that are reported alongside with the species distribution models. We used a Monte Carlo simulation approach to produce a range of possible exposure values based on the uncertainty in those underlying species distribution model maps. But we do want to also note that uncertainty isn't reported currently in a way that can produce a range of values around estimates for collision or displacement sensitivity. And so while most of the exposure in this tool is propagated directly from that first step, which is exposure, it is going to be a priority to improve the ways that we do quantify uncertainty in vulnerability indices that are developed in the future, to be able to also propagate metrics of that through tools like this. And I'll just show here the relative rank stability over those 1,000 Monte Carlo simulations for these species. Here you're seeing the priority rank out of the overall 57. These are the top species that filter into any of the top 10 ranks. And so you can see that pink-footed shearwater and Cassin's auklet are, they have very high rank stability. Their uncertainty is such that in all of those simulations, they rank out as the top 2 species, whereas some of these species with higher uncertainty, like for example, short-tailed albatross and Hawaiian petrel, do appear in some simulations in those higher ranks based on how little data we do have about their underlying exposure. Then in terms of takeaways of this work, alongside the report that we're publishing, we're also hoping to make a open source Shiny app tool where people can then work with me and also see online how the decision making of those priority species shifts as you consider different spatial scales, so as you develop future offshore wind energy areas. So it will give you the option to toggle between these different spatial scales. So for example, looking at the outputs for all Pacific Outer Continental Shelf development sites versus the priority scores when you just look, for example, at a single lease or at the California or state level. Takeaways from this. These single species and facility scale approaches towards decision making, so focusing primarily, for example, on marbled murrelets in the California current region, given they're one of the primary Endangered Species Act listed species, it's not going to be sufficient to protect all of these priority species that we do have, especially species like Cassin's auklet and pink-footed shearwater. We have a reasonable amount of certainty that they do have very high exposure risk. And so tools like this that do allow us to do this more regional scale planning to support cumulative impact needs are going to be priorities to develop and then apply to other regions in the future as we consider, or as we continue building out development across regions. And hopefully this will allow more informed prioritization of research, since we are working with limited resources and very quick timelines in a lot of cases. So being able to use tools like this to identify where there are those data gaps, but then also where we do have certainty about high priority species now, can help inform regional conversations about where we do need to target compensatory mitigation, for example. So with that, I'll say thanks. I think I'm slightly over time, but thank you all for listening.
That's great. And please join me in just thanking all of our speakers, because these were some really great presentations. And Aspen, you can stay on camera if you want for a little bit. Just we had a comment, and then I thought maybe I have a question if nobody else does. But Evan says that the Gulf of Mexico vulnerability assessment that Julia led does have an approach for incorporating uncertainty into the scoring. I could see it working for the Pacific vulnerability scores as well.
That's great to hear, Evan. I'm looking forward to digging more into that. It's a decision that was made, I think, alongside the update of the vulnerability index in the Pacific to have more categorical scores that we're reporting based on the various metrics. So like limited species, baseline information, limited number of reports, or like metrics were only from similar species, for example. And that's, I think, really helpful for informing some aspects of like data limitation, but isn't as helpful for this. So I'm looking forward to digging into other approaches and working with Emma in the future to be able to get those quantitative metrics around it. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. And then my question just had to do, I think you mostly addressed it, but I'd be curious to hear a little bit more from you, Aspen, about this question of, because of species prioritization, as you pointed out, is going to be a lot of non-ESA listed species, except for short-tailed albatross. And I know you're talking about offsetting. But then, of course, compensatory mitigation. Do you see that? Do you see the needs being filled maybe rather than by? Would it be by industry being required by the state, or do you see it more as a voluntary approach to actually be able to take on the efforts that need to fill in those species prioritization recommendations that you made?
Yeah, it's a good question. I am trying to kind of keep my finger on the pulse of that in California. I think that there's currently, at least locally, a lot of interest in sort of using the additional timing that we have here between us and when development is going to start, thanks to the current administration timing, to try and develop a bit more of a state level strategy. whether or not that ends up heading in the direction of strict mandatory compensation, I feel like is anyone's guess at this point, but it does seem like there's a decent amount of interest in trying to set up some kind of structure to like fund mitigation one way or another. And even if that's from voluntary funding, I see efforts like this as at least informing where that funding does go. And hopefully trying to demonstrate that there is a need to fund species that aren't currently protected. So I'm trying to use that to sort of push conversations forward. But I think there are still, there's still a good deal of uncertainty in terms of how that's actually going to play out at the state level.
Okay, yeah. And then David Bigger has a question for you. How general is the approach that you implemented that you showed to us? Could it be applied to other energy development activities?
It's a good question, Dave. I think I've been thinking about this, and I think that the answer is yes. This like conceptual framework and theoretical approach definitely could be applied to other energy development activities. And I think a good deal of the components could just be applied as is. For example, the underlying exposure, the way that we're calculating exposure and the way that we're thinking about threat could be used and then pretty quickly adapted with other metrics of sensitivity to other energy development activities to be able to apply, for example, offshore oil, oil spill risk, et cetera. I think that that is definitely a conceptual framework that has legs in terms of how we could use it for other applications. And frankly, in the California region, we probably have a good deal of cause to apply it to other energy development activities at this point as well. And we're also talking about applying the same conceptual framework to other regions, especially in more developing markets over internationally. So I think, yes, I think that the structure that we have and the theoretical understanding of how we can sort of do this cumulatively would be a great tool for other applications. Whether or not it's likely to inform as much management in other energy development activities, I have maybe more questions about. I think that there is a good amount of interest currently in voluntary mitigation for offshore wind where there might not be, for example, with oil. But whether or not that funds mitigation, I think that vulnerability approach itself is still helpful in those different applications.
Yeah, it's a good question. And it just in terms of relevance to the Gulf of Mexico work that we also recently completed, similarly to what Evan was saying, we had to sort of separate out the two as well, where Michaela Peterson is on the call taking notes, and I really thank Michaela for that as well. So she can speak to this more. But basically, in our case, exposure was most specific to could be adapted to multiple types of energy development because it's basically just spatial distributions, whereas vulnerability was most specific to wind energy development in particular. So it's worth thinking about that going forward when developing new vulnerability scores. We had to pivot, but coming up with ways to make them applicable to a broad menu of energy sources rather than just one set of renewable energy, as has been our focus in the past.
Big time, yeah. And I do feel like we're seeing that vulnerability index approach being applied to other applications as well, like the oil spill vulnerability index that went out a few years back now. I could see a tool like that filtering in just as easily as an offshore wind vulnerability index to apply an approach like this.
Yeah. That's great. Any other questions for Aspen? While people are thinking, it looks like Caleb is not on. Is there anybody on from the service who can actually stop the recording right now?
I'm on.
Oh, great. Who is that
Yep.
that just spoke?
I'm happy to stop it.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I think it'd be great. Okay.